Hello, I've been asked to speak to you about the critical realist concept of judgmental rationality. As you know, judgmental rationality is one of the three concepts in the so-called Holy Trinity of critical realism, the others being ontological realism and epistemic relativism. They are part of Roy Bhaskar's answer to his fundamental question, the basic question that he asks, starting with the realist theory of science. What should the world be like for science to be possible and intelligible? Although in this particular case, the question changes a little bit. What should human knowing be like for science to be possible and intelligible? What are the conditions for the possibility of doing science in particular, and knowing in general? The so-called Holy Trinity of critical realism, or as I prefer to call it, the triumvirate of original critical realism, consists of ontological realism, epistemic relativism, and judgmental rationality. The three are all important, and they are all related. Ontological realism, epistemic relativism, and judgmental rationality are critical realist beliefs about knowledge and knowing. They are assumptions that have an impact on our practice of science and our thinking and knowing in general. According to ontological realism, reality is intransitive, meaning the world that science investigates is independent of our perception and knowing. Otherwise, science would not make sense. According to epistemic relativism, human knowing is transitive. Our knowing is finite, contextual, and fallible. Judgmental rationality refers to a commitment to the rational evaluation of diverse and conflicting theories about the world. Perhaps it's already clear by now that this is what the task of science is all about. These three epistemic beliefs that comprise the triumvirate of critical realism are very much related to one another. It is ontological realism that provides the condition for the possibility of judgmental rationality, because the intransitive world is what serves as the basis for the exercise of judgmental rationality. On the other hand, epistemic relativism offers the rationale and the value for judgmental rationality. Our transitive knowing results in a plurality of assertions about the same world, and precisely because of this plurality, it mandates the exercise of our judgmental rationality. I think one way to illustrate this can be taken from Moshman's article in 2007 called Epistemic Development and the Perils of Pluto. So Moshman in his article asks, what happened to Pluto? It used to be a planet. What changed? Well, clearly, what changed was not the planet itself, but the definition of planets. The changing definition of planets illustrates to us the transitive dimension of knowing. Knowledge is relative. In a phrase, epistemic relativism. However, the very existence of Pluto and its characteristics are relatively abiding. It is independent of the changing scientific definition. This refers to the intransitive dimension of knowing. So while relativism is given permission to characterize knowing, the transitive dimension, it is prohibited from trickling down to affect reality itself. In short, the relativism of critical realism is merely epistemic. Knowledge is dependent on the knower, is created by the knower, and thus changes from knower to knower. Knowledge is finite, limited, it is perspectival, and it is fallible. However, as its name implies, critical realism subscribes to an unapologetic realism, and this realism is ontological. In other words, even if human knowing changes and the products of human knowing change, reality itself is autonomous of the knower. What critical realism does is that it restricts relativism to human knowing and prohibits it from characterizing reality itself. Now, this restriction is what will keep us from falling for what scholars today call the slippery slope of relativism and the relativist poisoned well of doubt. This is where judgmental rationality comes in. Judgmental rationality is the commitment to make a rational judgment in our task of evaluating different and sometimes competing accounts of the world. Here's an interesting picture I found on the internet that I think can illustrate the triumvirate of critical realism. Now, what do we have here? Here we have a cylinder in the center, and you have a square on the left and a circle on the right. It doesn't take much to figure out that what the picture is trying to say is that if you're standing to the right, what you may see of the cylinder is the shadow it casts on the wall, which is a square. Whereas if you're standing on the left, what you might actually see is the shadow of a circle that is also cast by the same cylinder. For me, this picture illustrates ontological realism, epistemic relativism, and judgmental rationality. Seeing a square shadow or a round shadow shows us the transitive dimension of knowing, while the cylinder itself refers to the intransitive dimension. Therefore, epistemic relativism is very clear here. Science and all human knowing are finite, perspectival, and fallible, resulting in different views about the same reality. Ontological realism says that reality is not a human product and is independent of the human knower. Therefore, judgmental rationality is possible. We should contrast epistemic relativism from judgmental relativism. Epistemic relativism refers to the perspectival, finite, and fallible character of human knowing. Judgmental relativism, on the other hand, allows this relativism to trickle onto ontology, so that evaluation or the exercise of judgmental rationality is no longer possible. Now, what I really value and what I really like about the triumvirate of critical realism is that its three categories allow us to understand better the differences between, on the one hand, a critical realist epistemology that is demanded by the practice of science, compared to the other two epistemologies that Roy Bhaskar critiques and refutes, namely naive realism and radical relativism. Let's take a look at their differences. We can differentiate the three epistemologies by analyzing whether or not they have the three elements of the triumvirate of critical realism. A naive realist subscribes to ontological realism. He or she believes that the world is intransitive, is independent of the knower, but does not seem to subscribe to epistemic relativism. That's why it's called naive. There is no consciousness of the historicity of human knowing. As a result, the exercise of judgmental rationality seems limited, because while it is made possible by ontological realism, its value is constrained by the lack of a belief in epistemic relativism. On the other hand, a radical relativist epistemology, while it strongly subscribes to epistemic relativism, denies ontological realism. It holds that human knowing is finite and perspectival, but it does not acknowledge an intransitive world out there, and as a result, judgmental rationality is not even possible. Only a critical realist epistemology has all three elements, because only with ontological realism is the full exercise of judgmental rationality possible, and only with epistemic relativism is this judgmental rationality mandated and considered valuable. So we could say that for a naive realist, knowledge is facts that can only be received usually from authority. On the other hand, for a radical relativist, knowledge is mere opinion, and all we need to do is respect opinion. All opinions are equally valid. It is only with a critical realist epistemology that we continue to commit ourselves to evaluating the different and conflicting claims about the world. Because for a critical realist, knowledge is not fact, knowledge is not opinion, but it is a judgment to be evaluated and a judgment to be made. Another value for me of the triumvirate of critical realism, especially judgmental rationality, is that it clarifies a difference that is so often blurred today. And I'm referring to pluralism on the one hand and relativism on the other hand. Pluralism is to be able to respect and be open to other views, something that a critical realist epistemology certainly embraces. Relativism, however, is the acceptance that all views are equally correct, thereby abandoning our responsibility and commitment to rational evaluation, or in Basker's term, judgmental rationality. One takeaway from triumvirate of critical realism is that our beliefs, our tacit assumptions about knowing, have an impact on the way we think, specifically on critical thinking. We need a critical realist epistemology to do science and to engage in critical thinking today. When you think about it, the enterprise of science is a continual exercise of judgmental rationality by the scientific community. Thinking as well is an enterprise of judgmental rationality. For Bhaskar, judgmental rationality is not only an epistemic task, it is an ethical responsibility.